So I think we should start. And welcome everyone to the first BHI colloquium of 2021. Today is our pleasure to have Noémie Globus, and she's a postdoctoral researcher working in high energy astrophysics and astrobiology. She did her PhD at the Paris Observatory in France, and then she moved to Israel to work as a postdoctoral fellow at Tel Aviv University and the Hebrew University until 2018. And then she moved to the USA with the NYU and CCA with long-term visiting position at Stanford University and Riken in Japan until the end of previous year, so December 31st, 2021. And since January, so very recently, she works at Elite Beamlines in the Czech Republic, and she's still affiliated with the CCA. So please, Noémie, take it away.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me. So I will talk about the chiral puzzle of life, and I will try to make you understand the connection between the images that you can see on the screen. This is an air shower, an illustration of an air shower. This is at the Pierre, the picture was taken at the Pierre Auger Observatory site. This is a question that someone asked me. I don't know if it was recorded or not. Here you have DNA, and here you have a timeline diagram showing you decay. So I will try to make the connection during my talk between those elements. So I will start with a little bit of history as an introduction. The first slide is on the contribution of wine to the scientific knowledge. Here everything started with wine. So in 1769, Carl William Scheele was examining tartar. This is tartar is acid, which is deposited in cask during wine fermentation. And I mean, he was very interested in this. And as you will see, this tartaric acid will have important implications for the discovery of homochirality. In 1815, the optical activity was studied by Jean-Baptiste Biot. It was studied experimentally, and he wanted to understand theoretically what was going on. He had some hints. So he was doing the experiment with linearly polarized light, and he witnessed that when you put some molecule in a solution, some of them has the interesting property to turn the plane of the polarized light clockwise or counterclockwise. And he was trying to understand what was the physical process at play that was, making this rotation. So he didn't know. And in 1848, Pasteur was also studying optical activity. And he had the chance to actually have a racemic acid salt. Racemic meaning that actually, as he drew here in this, this is his own drawing, there were two types of crystal in his tartaric acid sample, and he drew them, and they are mirror image of one another. And this separation was made with a tweezer. So Pasteur made the first separation ever of enantiomeric separation. So he separated those two crystals and he put them into solution. And then he showed to Jean-Baptiste Biot that one solution was turning the plane of polarized light to the left, and the other one was turning the plane of polarized light to the right. And Biot was very moved by this experiment. He said something like, "Oh, I love physics all my life, that this touches my very heart." So that was Pasteur's contribution. And he also witnessed that actually all natural substances have one-handedness. So one type of crystal are only present in natural substances. And I mean, they were making other experiments, and I will come back to Pasteur later on. But first, I would like just also, after this historical introduction, just made some basic definitions, because we are going to use them in the talk. So enantiomer is, as I said, a chiral molecule. It cannot be superimposed into its mirror image. And life building blocks are molecules that are all chiral. And more interestingly, the living systems are only using one type of enantiomer, in the amino acids, which are all left-handed, but this is a human convention. And the thing is that when you actually try to synthesize the amino acid in laboratory, because we wanted to understand how life building blocks were formed at the beginning, because we want to understand the origin of life. So here you have the well-known Miller-Urey experiment in 1952 that were trying to mimic the condition of early Earth. And they actually made amino acids. So this is the result of the experiment. But they made them in equal quantities of both right and left-handed. And the living organism, as I said, only use the left-handed type. So another puzzle comes from space. So we can actually measure the excess of one type of amino acid over the other. We call it enantiomeric excess. So it's the number of right-handed molecules minus the number of left-handed molecules over the total. And you can see here, so this is for different different meteorites. You see that in some of them, you actually can witness enantiomeric excesses of 20%. Of course, there are error bars, and there was some debate because meteorites are found on Earth, so it could be subject to Earth contamination. But this is the status right now, and this is very interesting because we can actually see that there is an excess in left-handed amino acids. So there is another important life building blocks that are the ones that make the nucleic acids. So you can see here there are two possible systems. We are only using one of them, which is the dRNA and the DNA. And they are based on right-handed sugar. So you see here on the bottom, the chiral unit of this helical structure. It's made of the sugar, the base, as you know, ATCG, and the phosphate. So you have the sugar phosphate backbone, and the sugar is chiral. And because all the sugar are right-handed, then the helix can adopt a stable structure, and the helices in DNA are the ones that we are using are right-handed. This is the most stable configuration because all the sugar are right-handed. So why are we using only this system, and why are we not using the other one? Because as I said, there is no energy difference when we are making them in laboratory. We are making them in equal quantities of both. So what happened at the beginning that life started to use only one type, and did it happen by chance, or is there any deterministic reason for this? So the question is what broke the biological mirror, and I wrote here that there was a nice anticipation by Pasteur. I won't say a prediction, but it was an anticipation. So he said that because we can see that living system only use one type of enantiomer and not the other, so life has a specific handedness. He thought that this must be due to some asymmetry in the fundamental law of nature. So this is what he is writing here. He said, mais je regarde comme nécessaire la conclusion de l'existence de forces dissymétriques, so the existence of dissymetric forces, so in the law of physics. And this was a nice anticipation because it was in 1848, as I said, and it was a century before the discovery of the parity violation in the weak interaction. So this is why I thought it's a nice anticipation. So as you know, I mean, I will not spend too much time of this, but in 1957, there was the discovery of the parity violation. Here you can see a sketch of the experiment. And one interesting property in the decay of cobalt-60 is that the electrons that are emitted has spin polarization, and they are emitted in one direction. So this is how you can see actually that there was a violation in the conservation of parity. So after this discovery, of course, people try to make the connection between the parity violation in the weak interaction and the asymmetry in the molecule of life. And there were many research made on this topic. So I actually made a table summarizing the possible experimental path to homochirality. Some of them were successful. The other ones are still at the theoretical level. So I just want to briefly summarize them. So there are like two types of scenario, of course, because you can make an enantiomeric excess is the building block of life in the primordial soup. So the amino acids or the sugar, for example, or you can say that maybe this was due to evolution. So this is what we call transbiotic, because we need already to have a made polymerization of the building blocks into a longer chain, and that you have molecules that are able to self-replicate. So for the first processes, I will start with actually the second one because I introduced the weak interaction. So after this discovery, people try to actually see if there is an energy difference between the two enantiomers. So usually in the Hamiltonian, you use only electromagnetic forces, but then you can introduce the difference due to the weak neutral currents, and you can calculate the difference in the energy level into the for the two molecules. And what you can see is that it's very, very small, something like 10 to the 17 kT. So there were much debate to understand if actually this energy difference could be amplified by some phase transition, for example. So this was a very well-known paper by Abdus Salam, and other people also work on this. And they try also to do it in laboratory experiment, but it has not been successful yet. But this is really linked to the weak interaction. So this is why what we read, if it's involved W. Then you have, of course, the possibility I mean, the weak interaction is linked to beta decay. So is it possible to destroy enantiomer selectively one enantiomer over the other? So this experiment has been done putting samples next to radioactive elements, for example, by Bonner, but it has there is still debate on how much you can actually how much excess you can make with this experiment. So this was not very successful either. The two ones that are successful are irradiation of amino acid by ultraviolet circularly polarized light. So this leads to a differential destruction of one enantiomer over the other. The chiral preference would depend on the chirality of the light and on the photon energy, but this is actually working and producing enantiomeric excess of a few percent. And so this is very promising, but then you have to understand how you can make the link to the weak interaction. It's not obvious, and you must also think of a source which has very narrow bent because the excess actually has been shown to depend, as I said, on the photon energy. But it works. And also, I mean, enantioselective chemistry made with a low energy spin polarized electron. So this also depends on the spin polarization and of the electron and the electron energy. And I wrote here also the authors that are working on this, but these are, I mean, this is ongoing research to understand what could have made the excesses in the prebiotic soup. And then you have the transbiotic, which what I said involve chiral molecules, helical molecules, sorry. So there are, I mean, since a decade or even a bit more, I think 15 years, there have been a lot of research on what is called the chiral-induced spin selectivity. So it was led by Ron Nahman, and just showed that actually if you take a helical double-stranded DNA, then the DNA can act as a spin filter for low energy electrons, and it's very efficient. You can actually filter 90% of one spin polarization over the other. And then what I will talk about is the link to cosmic ray, because cosmic ray are evolutionary pressure. So because we are irradiated all the time by cosmic rays, so they induce mutations. And if some of the cosmic rays are spin polarized, as I will show, then maybe you could have an enantioselective mutagenesis. And this is already happening on the living system. So you can maybe make a bias in the evolutionary pressure and favor one type of life form over the other. So, I mean, this will be the subject of the next slides. So, so to understand the chiral bias and how it can be produced before introducing cosmic rays themselves, you have to make a model. So you have to make a model of the molecular chirality. You can introduce a pseudoscalar to describe your helix. So I mean with 3 vectors, and you can easily see that in the mirror, then this quantity will have the opposite sign. You can also involve charge distribution in the description of your molecule or magnetic moments, because we know that they have. So for example, here you have another example. You have a distribution of charges on the sphere, which is chiral. The surface density is chiral. And then you have a magnetic moment. So you have like a product of electric and magnetic vector, and this change sign in a mirror. So we wanted to investigate first what would be the stronger effect. So for example, for the helical DNA, you can make a simple model of the distribution of charges because it will be like a helical Barber pole. So of course the reality is more complicated, but this is what we choose. And then we want to link this into a chiral preference. So we assume that the mutation is, the chiral preference in the mutation ray is expressed as the product of the molecular chirality and the lodacity. So now I will explain what this is. The lodacity is just when you have a cosmic ray that will ionize a molecule. If it's been polarized, it will have also a magnetic moment. So this is what is important here. And I will show you why. And the dot product of the velocity vector and the magnetic moment, this is the quantity we call lodacity. So it's different than the spin polarization because the magnetic moment contains a charge. So if polarized cosmic ray act as an evolutionary pressure, and this is expressed in the product m dot L, which change sign in a mirror because you would have the two different m, but for cosmic ray, as I will show, you have only one type of lodacity, then you could maybe make bias in the evolution of life, and then after homochiral time scale, you would have the dominance of one life form over the other. So this is a testable idea, and I will talk about this at the end. Now I will explain why the low density is always of the same sign in cosmic radiation. So I come back to this picture of air shower. So you have a primary cosmic ray that initiate this, what you can see here is a shower of billions of secondary particles for the highest energy cosmic ray, which are 10 to the 20 electron volts. The shower is over 100 billions of particles in the atmosphere. So the atmosphere will act as a filter, and you will not have the same particle on the top of the atmosphere than on the ground. And this will also depend on the environment. So this is illustrated here. So this is for a vertical cosmic ray proton of 1 PeV. You can see here the different species, and this is different for the Earth, which is in a solid line, for Mars, which is dashed, and for Titan, which is dotted. And you see that the shower maximum for Earth arrives something like 4 or 5 kilometers above the ground. But if you are on Mars, it never reaches the maximum. So because the atmosphere now on Mars is thinner than on Earth, so you are not so much protected by the cosmic radiation. And something which is interesting here is that you see the muon component, which is in blue here. On Earth, it's start to dominate at ground level. So muons are very interesting because they are the link to the weak interaction. They come from a two-body decay. So they mainly come from a pion decay. So you have here illustration of what happened in the pion rest frame. So for a negative pion and a positive pion. And it's a two-body decay involving a neutrino. So in the rest frame of the pion, actually you have the spin parallel or anti-parallel to the velocity vector. But if now you look at the magnetic moment, which involves the charge, it's the gyromagnetic ratio times the spin, then you see that for both decay, the magnetic moment is always anti-aligned with the velocity vector. So this is in the rest frame of the pion. And then, of course, if you are here on the ground, you need to Lorentz transform to have this mu dot v, which is the quantity we are interested in. But you can actually calculate it, and even if you Lorentz transform it, it will retain some of the polarization. It will not be 100% like in the pion rest frame, but on average, it has always the same sign. So on average, the magnetic moment of the cosmic ray is always anti-aligned with the velocity vector for muon. So this is a pseudo-scalar quantity, and this, as we showed, is what can make a chiral bias. So to understand this and to understand the magnitude of the effect, we took this Barber-Pole model for the DNA, because DNA is the guarantor of the genetic information. So what you want to do is to make changes in the DNA molecule with this spin polarized cosmic ray. So we treated ionization as a proxy for mutation. And then what we did is that we just calculate the difference in the trajectory for cosmic ray, which is non-spin polarized, a cosmic ray, which is polarized. And it's similar to the Sturm-Gerlach term here. So you have mu, which is a magnetic moment dotted with this quantity, which is a magnetic field that the cosmic ray see. And the perturbed trajectory, I mean, this is because the cosmic ray is spin polarized. After you want to understand, of course, how strong is the difference in the ionization between the left-handed helix and the right-handed helix. So this, as I said, has been calculated with taking a simple Barber-Pole model for the electrostatic potential, but then we introduce a quantity that we call the mutability, which is the probability per unit length to act on the mutation. And we had to, of course, there is an impact factor, and we had to integrate over all possible angles because in reality, the molecule can have all possible orientation. And after you do all this, so I will not enter into the detail, but the effect that we found is actually quite small. So the bias, the difference in the ionization rate between the two molecules, it's something like, it could be 10 to the minus 6 for a keV electron or 10 to the minus 10 for MeV muon. So it's very small, but the thing is that maybe even a small difference in the mutation rate would be amplified by the self-replication processes because you have here living organisms. So if you introduce a very small difference in the mutation rate because it's a living system that is growing exponentially, then at some point you start to make a difference in the evolution of one over the other. So that was the idea here. And also it was a very simple model. So we did not consider quantum mechanical effects. And I mean, this has to be done in the future because that could make a difference, and the effect could be actually larger than what we did calculated in this simple model. So that was just a summary, but I think I said all this. So the thing is that cosmic radiation is a small bias, but it's persistent. So we are always irradiated by cosmic ray. The thing is that it would depend on the environment, of course, because the air shower, as I showed you on Earth, will not develop the same way because the Earth has a particular atmosphere. So if you take other bodies in the solar system, the air shower will not be the same. So it depends where you actually start to form these first living systems, and that we don't know. So we are looking now for biosignature and for enantiomeric excesses measurement in situ by space missions. So I talk about meteorites. There was an attempt to measure the enantiomeric excesses in a comet. Unfortunately, it didn't work because the lander found itself in the dark. So this was the Rosetta mission, and the lander was Philae, and he bounced on the comet and found himself in the dark zone. So the solar panel could not work. But that was the plan actually, to see if there was any excess at the surface in the organic compounds that were found. And I put here Hayabusa 2 and OSIRIS-REx. So there are two missions that went to asteroids, Ryugu for Hayabusa and Bennu for OSIRIS-REx. And one is a Japanese mission, the other one is a NASA mission. The Japanese one, maybe you saw this in the news, returned on December 6, 2020. So they are now analyzing the samples, and OSIRIS-REx will come back in 2023. So this is the landing of the capsule in Australia, and that was the first pictures of the capsule. So we have no news right now, but we'll see. Maybe they will find interesting things. So even maybe living system, who knows? So to calculate this cosmic radiation, which is spin polarized in different environments, one environment which is actually interesting to consider is Mars. In 2018, there was detection by radar of water, I mean underground, like a lake. I would not say an ocean, something like 1.5 kilometers beneath the surface. And there was also discoveries of some deposits. So this is a work done by our collaborator, David Dimmer, that actually studied the possibility that life started in hot spring because of the wet-dry cycles that are able to polymerize the nucleotide, which are the building block of DNA, into long chain. And so this is actually shown to work in laboratory. And the question is how from this first biopolymer you could actually make the first living system. So the transition from inert to living is, as you know, not understood. But this wet-dry cycle seems to be promising. So if you want to see where it could have happened, then this is the hot spring hypothesis. Then you can see that there are some sites on Mars actually that where this wet-dry cycling process could have been working. So what we did, and this is in a new study, is that we calculate the development of air shower in these different environments that I just told you about. So here you have a comparison between Earth and Mars. As I said, on Earth, we start to be dominated by polarized muon at ground level, and then this is underground. And for Mars, so this is, sorry, I should have said this. This is the radiation dose in milligray per year. And the bottom panel here shows you the polarized fraction. So you see that here you are dominated by the electromagnetic part of the shower, and you start to be dominated by the spin polarized part at ground level and then underground. But for Mars, because of its thinner atmosphere, then you really start to be dominated by the spin polarized component, something like 10-meter water equivalent beneath its surface. So this is just an illustration. And so for our model to work, of course, we need to be in a zone which is dominated by the spin polarized component of cosmic ray. We did the calculation also for icy moon and asteroids. So here as an illustration, this is a picture and an illustration of Enceladus, which is Saturn moons, and is also thought to have ocean beneath its surface, so beneath the icy crust. We see these nice plumes, and the Cassini mission actually analyzed what is in these plumes and found organic molecules as well. So Enceladus and Europa are also bodies when we are looking for biosignature, and so the cosmic ray would develop showers as well, even if there is no atmosphere and at a certain depth. So actually the doses are lower than on Earth or on Mars, but you see that here you have a zone which is in purple when you are dominated actually by the spin polarized muon as well. I think I'm running out of time. So very quickly, I will make the connection with black holes because it's a Black Hole Initiative colloquium. So this cosmic rays, I mean, we are detecting cosmic rays at all energies, but the flux of cosmic ray is, as you know, decreasing. And for the highest energy, we detect 1 particle per kilometer square per year, around 10 to the 18 electron volts. And for the highest energy one, 10 to the 21 electron volts, is 1 particle per kilometer square per century. So this is why we are building these big observatories, like the Pierre Auger and the Telescope Array experiment, which are the current high energy cosmic ray observatories. But the fluxes of these cosmic rays are very low. And so they have very huge Larmor radii, and they are very, very energetic. For the one that are, the flux is something like 1 particle per meter square per year, we see here an inflection in the cosmic ray spectrum. These are the ones that we believe come from supernovae remnants. So why there is a connection with a black hole here is that for the highest energies, For the supernova remnants, some of them, of course, come from the death of very massive stars. So after this, the remnant would be a black hole. You have also the possibility that outflows at the galactic center accelerate some of the cosmic rays. The study on anisotropy are not able right now to distinguish between both because they are charged particles, so they are deflected by the intervening magnetic fields. And for the highest energy ones, this is a very famous image right now. We don't know what are the sources of ultra high energy cosmic ray. This is a puzzle since 60 years. And this, I just show you a possibility, which is M87. And why it's a possibility is because associated to the black hole, you have this powerful relativistic jets that could be very good acceleration site for the highest energy particles. So to come back to the galactic ones, what we did, because these are the ones that will dominate for the muon flux we observe, because the highest one, as I said, the flux is very, very low. We calculated what would be the increase in the radiation dose if we have a nearby supernovae 100 years after its explosion. So this is a supernova which would be located at 50 parsec from the Earth. And you see here that the increase can be something like a few orders of magnitude. So then it would last for thousands of years, and this could also actually have played a role, because this would increase the radiation dose. It will just, I mean, the polarized muons, if the atmosphere is the same, will still dominate at ground level, but there will be more numerous, so the radiation dose would be higher. So I'm not sure I have time to say all this. What I want just to point out is that it's a really interdisciplinary research because we have to work with experts in biomolecular engineering and also work with biologists to understand the effect of spin polarization on the evolution of life. And our aim is to actually conduct radiation biology experiment to see if bacteria respond differently to spin polarized radiation of different helicities. So just as a summary, the origin of homochirality is a fundamental problem because homochirality is one signature. It's a necessary step. It's one of the steps that we have to understand the emergence of life. It connects biology, chemistry, and physics. We don't know if it happened by chance or if it's due to the deterministic effect of the weak interaction. We don't know if it happened at the prebiotic or the biotic level. What we want to investigate is the biotic one, because naturally it will amplify a very small bias, because just the living organism will grow exponentially. We have to understand in which environment. So this is what we started to try to understand with calculating the spin polarized radiation dose in different environments that are prime targets for the search of life in our solar system. We showed that muons are more promising than electrons just because they retain their low density more. And I mean, this I already said. We don't know exactly what is the homochiralization timescale because we don't know how strong would be the response to polarized radiation. Even UV circularly polarized light on bacteria has not been tested. So this is very new. Usually the experiments are made on amino acids and not on bacteria. And so it's a testable idea. And I mean, this is one of my dream would be to test it. So thank you. And I will be very happy to take questions. I'm sorry I ran out of time.
No worries. Thank you, Noémie, for a very interesting talk. I have to say that at the BHI, we very rarely talk about life in general. So it was a welcome news. So let's hear some questions. So I'll get it started. You said that you know, black holes and supernova are interesting environment because they are like cosmic rays accelerator. And if you take a like a prototypical black hole that we talk about here, so M87, supermassive black hole, very famous, etc. So you have any idea what's the radius or the distance from the central black hole where cosmic rays flux would be reasonable, not too high, not too low for what you're talking about?
So this object is actually, I mean, I showed this object for the flux of the very high energy ones. So the flux is very low.
Yeah.
We don't know what are the, this is one possibility. We don't know what are the sources of ultra high energy cosmic ray. When we say ultra high is above 10 to the 18. And so what we can do is that we can assume it's, for example, made in this active galactic nuclei, and we can calculate what would be the output. Now, it's not very active, as you know, the luminosity is something like 10 to the 43. In the past, it has been higher, so it could have accelerate cosmic ray up to the highest energies. And this object is at 16.5 megaparsec from us. So this is also ongoing research because we don't really know what are the acceleration mechanisms. So as you can see here, you have a jet, and you have the jet is more luminous on the edges. So you may think this is due to shocks, and maybe you can accelerate the cosmic ray into these shocks. So this is open questions. So I'm not sure I can answer your question with a number. Depending on what you assume as a model for the acceleration, you will have, and depending on what you assume for the injection of cosmic rays that you want to reaccelerate, then you can have an output in the form of a cosmic ray spectrum, and then you have to propagate this cosmic ray from the source to the Earth. So we don't know either what are the extragalactic magnetic field, but we can assume a diffusion coefficient. So this is just simple diffusion for the extragalactic medium, and then you can have what would be the increase in the cosmic ray flux at the Earth.
Okay.
But it's not very promising for this, for our model, because the mutation rate, as I said, for this highest energy is 1 particle per kilometer square per year or per century. So for our model, we are dominated by the galactic ones. So this is by the rate of supernova happening in our galaxy. And the question was, if we have one in our local neighborhood, how much it would have increased the cosmic ray flux on Earth.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And you were talking about some biosig. Oh no, there is a question from Luis. Please go ahead.
Hello. Hello, Noemi. You read me?
It's breaking down a bit.
It's a bit low.
You mentioned on the side that is a chiral molecule, the only chiral molecule observed in this stellar medium.
Can you write your question? You have a problem with your connection, I think. Can you type your question in the chat, maybe?
I don't know. I mean, can you hear me or not?
No, we can't hear you very well. It would be better if you just wrote the question in the chat.
Okay, I do that.
Okay.
I don't see the chat, so could you just tell me his question? Thanks.
Yeah, I will read it.
But I'm sorry, I have no access to the chat. I don't know why.
I don't know what you said. I'm sorry, I can't understand it.
You can take other question while he's writing.
I'm so sorry, I can't. That doesn't work.
Maybe he's saying that it doesn't work, the chat. I think the question was related to the interstellar medium. I kind of understood a couple of words.
If there are chemical molecule in the interstellar medium.
My question, I don't know, I cannot use the chat, I don't know why. But my question was only, is propylene oxide is a carbon molecule observed in the interstellar medium, but no way to measure if it is an EG or Ml molecule. It's not possible.
The question is if we can measure the handedness of molecules in the interstellar medium.
Yes.
Yes, he said yes.
I think one chiral molecule has been detected, but I'm not sure it has to be, the signal of our noise would be very low for the, I don't even know if people are trying to do this. So I cannot answer this because I don't know.
Okay.
There was this propylene oxide, right, that was discovered recently. It was the first chiral molecule. But your question is if we can see enantiomeric excesses, right? So that I don't know. I know the flux would be too low. So I don't know how we could do it.
Okay.
Already for the object in the solar system, it's difficult. So this is, I guess, why they are doing it in situ or bringing back samples.
So I had another question actually. What are the biosignatures that you are looking for? You mentioned that there are some sample return missions like OSIRIS-X, etc. There is some molecule specifically that you're looking for biosignatures in those missions?
Well, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So, and we know the life on Earth is using only one enantiomer. So we cannot really, we don't know how to define life, but if we find that for some reason, the samples only contain, the left-handed version of the amino acids and that they are similar to those that we see on Earth, then I guess we will call this biosignature. But nothing tells you really that, life in the universe is using exactly the same molecules that are life on Earth. So,
yeah.
So it's interesting to see that, homochirality is a signature of life here. And this is why we are looking for this enantiomeric excesses, because we want to understand the origin of it. And if there is life elsewhere, is likely to be homochiral. The question is, has it the same handedness as we have? So, like Feynman was saying, if you meet an alien, maybe don't give him your right hand, because if he's based on the other, if he's based on the mirror image molecules, then this is so we don't know. And I guess one other biosignature would be nucleotides. The right-handed sugars. So if there are excesses in right-handed sugars, that would be interesting as well, because the nucleic acids that we have are only using also one type of handedness for the sugars. Other type of Your signature would be maybe linked to, you know, photosynthesis or metabolic processes, I would say. But this is not the one that I was describing in the talk. I was just talking about the enantiomeric excesses because that was the subject.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. So I don't see any more questions. So let's thank our speaker again for a very nice talk. And I'll see you in a week, next BHI colloquium. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again.
Bye-bye.